So hello again to everyone. Good evening to those joining in the US and good morning to those joining from Japan. We're excited to share that we have had over 100 people register from around the world. Of course, we wish everyone safety and health during this uncertain time. In our current global situation, it is essential that we continue to communicate across borders and cultures, as well as within our own communities. Our program is part of achieving this goal. Tonight is also a unique opportunity to connect with Cool Japan, which is an official Japanese government initiative to promote aspects of Japanese popular culture, including the globally influential gaming industry. My name is Paul Pass, and I am the Executive Director of the Japan America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary in 2020, and this event is one of the first in our summer programming season. Please note that this webinar is on the record and will be recorded. It will be uploaded to the JAS DFW website and YouTube channel, likely as early as tomorrow. Since this event is set up as a Zoom meeting, we kindly ask that all attendees mute their microphones and turn off their cameras for the duration of the program. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function on the bottom of your screen. Please note that this is different than our recent events, which use the Q&A function. We encourage you to ask early, since we may not be able to address all questions. If you wish to give in order to support the legacy of the Japan America Society and its promising future, we kindly ask that you consider a donation to help us continue our great work in the community. In a few moments, we will share a link in the chat box for our online giving portal. Now to begin our program is Matthew Hopkins, who will serve as tonight's moderator. He is a producer and curator at Attract Mode, as well as an editor with Fort 90. Matthew, please feel free to begin.
Hey, Paul, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for joining us all. I know there's a lot of things going right now, so appreciate the fact that we can just kind of take a moment and just, spend some time together to talk about Cool Japan, video games, and COVID. So before we're going any further, let's how about we have each of our panelists introduce themselves, starting with yourself, Ollie.
Oh, hello. My name is Oliver Barder. I am a freelance journalist that writes for places such as Forbes. I specialize in anime and games and other sort of Japanese pop culture. I've also worked in the games industry as a game designer for close to 15 years, and I'm now game director in Japan. So that's me.
And meanwhile, here in America, another game developer is Dan.
Yep. So I am Dan Hewitt. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at Gearbox Entertainment Company, which is based in Frisco, Texas. I have been the CCO at Gearbox since August of last year. And before Gearbox, I ran communications at the Entertainment Software Association, which is the U.S. video game industry's trade body. And while there, I also ran E3, which is a major video game event that I'm sure you all are aware of or heard about or have been to. So that is me.
All right. But you're down in Texas, and meanwhile up here in New York City, fellow New Yorker, Naomi, how you doing?
Hi, yeah, I'm Naomi Clark. Like Matt just mentioned, I'm based in New York, and I teach at New York University's game design program, also known as the NYU Game Center. But I've also been a game developer working in the industry for a little over 20 years. A lot of different types of games, web and mobile games. I worked for many years for Lego. More recently, I've been doing independent game development with small studios and putting out some of my own card games and things like that.
Now, I know that you grabbed some headlines, Naomi, recently by doing something in NYU Game Center related to Animal Crossing. Can you explain that to everyone for us, please?
Yeah, we had been doing a streaming show every week with myself and the chair of the NYU Game Center, Frank Lance, where we talk about news headlines related to games. And a lot of those news headlines in the last few months have been about Animal Crossing. We kept doing the streaming show after everything kind of went remote and everyone was socially distanced, staying at home. And so we were watching what was going on with this sort of explosion of interest in Animal Crossing. So we ended up talking a lot about the cultural background of Animal Crossing. I think the thing that really got people interested was yeah, trying to analyze whether Tom Nook is a good guy or a bad guy, kind of a classic debate about that franchise, right? And I compared the way that debt and mortgages work in Animal Crossing, which has been this sort of big weird thing for a lot of for a lot of American gamers. It might be true in Japan as well, but I found it interestingly similar to how village debt used to work in kind of the past centuries, back in like it would be in Japan in the 17th and 18th centuries, when you had a money economy that was operating at a national or regional level, but then a lot of villages, they only had like one person, like the head person would be the one interfacing with the money economy to do trade. And so everybody else had this sort of collective debt that was shared by the whole village. So we did a little segment on that, and it ended up going on YouTube and getting a lot of attention.
I mean, I think it goes without saying that right when COVID happened here in America, well, you know, it's when it finally spread out and everyone had to go into lockdown. So what happens, Animal Crossing came out, and me personally, as a Nintendo fan, Animal Crossing was never in my top 10 list of games series that I really cared about. But I probably played that game more than any other Nintendo game, just by hour. And I have to ask Ollie, in Japan, has Animal Crossing fever been as prevalent over there, and for the same reasons why it's so popular in America? Because it's been such a big thing for lockdown.
It's definitely been popular. It's definitely sold very well, but and social media was definitely going crazy about it. But for some reason, it had a much sort of bigger sort of resonance in the States for some reason, which I thought was quite fascinating. I mean, it's definitely popular, but there have been other games released recently as well. So it's kind of been a bit more of a mix. And generally, gamers here, it's not as sometimes as monolithic in terms of what people enjoy playing. But Animal Crossing was definitely very popular.
Now, I think everyone in this panel is well aware of the fact that video games are very popular in Japan, and video games are very popular in America. But both countries, both cultures process them, they enjoy them rather differently. Can you maybe discuss a bit more about what the typical video game player is? Can you give a kind of a character portrait in Japan?
I'm not sure
where they go and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I can give like a typical, because that's the kind of interesting thing, is it's very varied. I think what's probably better to kind of give an analysis on the difference in the types of games and the kind of the focus, in the sense that in Japan, when people think of games, they think of them closer to something like toys. And, you know, Nintendo's origins partly were, you know, as a toy company. So you know, when people talk about going to, you know, like arcades and things here, it's much more about sort of, you know, the sense of play. Whereas generally outside of Japan, especially in America, at least from my experience, that, you know, emphasis, like the movie industry has a very big influence on games. So there's kind of more of a movie kind of thing. Sorry, Matt.
Now, obviously, I think a lot of people resonate with Animal Crossing because of certain themes and a certain atmosphere. I hate to put you on a hot spot, Dan, but as a developer, Gearbox makes a different type of game, and it has an audience. Like, how are you guys dealing with the fact that a lot of gamers, a lot of people in general we've always played games for escape to a large part, but now we're escaping from a different thing, from real world, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think that's so. Our mission at Gearbox is to entertain the world, and we, as our corporate mission statement, want to bring happiness and joy to people. And I think that now more than ever, people, to your point, Matt, are looking for an escape. But I think that there are two other different groups of folks who are playing games right now. I think that one of those groups are folks who we're calling recurring gamers, and people who used to play video games but maybe set down the controller or didn't necessarily jump on their PC and play video games all the time. And those people are coming back. And I think that the third bucket is people who have not necessarily played video games before at all, but now have the opportunity to enjoy games. And I think that, you know, and Ollie mentioned movies, but I think where we come from and the ethos that we have about this is just like that there's a lot of different movies and books and music out there for a wide variety of tastes. There's a video game for everybody, and certainly with the Borderlands series, which is immensely popular, and we love our fans and we love the positive reception that gets. We also are seeing an uptick in the catalog of titles that we publish. So I think that right now it's a golden age of video games where we're able to put content before a wide range of people.
I'm assuming that we've heard like a lot of people are playing older games now. Used games are becoming a big thing. Have you seen that a lot of people are playing perhaps games that you published maybe 5-10 years ago, all of a sudden finding a new audience?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing that, and certainly that is something that we're grateful for. People who are going back and picking up fan favorites, and that's fantastic, and we love it. But here at Gearbox, one of the challenges that we've had since the virus began, and since we began working from home, is how do we make sure that we continue to deliver on our promise of entertaining the world for our fans and our customers. And so if you look at, let's say, mid-February, when we really started beginning planning in earnest for work from home period, in that time, we've rolled out 13 patches for 2 video games. We released Borderlands 3 on Steam. We introduced crossplay for Epic and Steam. We completed and launched Borderlands Science. We released Borderlands 3 Cartel Event. So I say all that by way of saying, while yes, people certainly are going back and playing fan favorites, we also have an obligation and a duty to continue to provide new content for our customers and our fans, and that's something that we're delivering on.
Now, Ollie, a lot of people here in America consider Japan to be the birthplace of video games, or modern video games. And I know that Japan has a very thriving, or so it is perceived in America by a video game enthusiast that, and I went to Japan and there's used game shops, etc. like that. How do you think COVID has affected that? Are places like Super Potato, which is I think the most famous retro game seller, are they open? Are they closed? Like, are arcades open? Oh, I think we lost Ollie's audio.
Sorry. What happened previously was we didn't really have a lockdown in Tokyo. We had a state of emergency. So that meant that a lot of places that decided to close did so voluntarily. Some shops did close, but at the moment, obviously things like COVID has affected the bricks and mortar shops, which is the bulk of the secondhand retro gaming shops in Tokyo. So it's definitely had an impact. However, what's kind of interesting, and I've been sort of seeing this online as well in discussions with, is that there's been a real influx of amazing secondhand, very rare games in lots of shops across Tokyo, because there's not the same kind of turnover because people aren't obviously going. So the stock's kind of building up, and there are some people turning up and going, I haven't seen this game in like forever, and picking it up, no problem. But the digital side of it has really blossomed, obviously, because everyone's having to work, as everyone's at home. But the secondhand market, I think, probably has taken a bit of a hit, sadly, especially the bricks and mortar shops.
Well, speaking of used games, I remember I visited the NYU Game Center recently because I'm actually getting a master's in library sciences, and I wanted to check out NYU's Game Center's library. And Naomi, maybe you can illuminate the fact that you guys have a lot of old, and I think a lot of old rare games as well, correct?
Yeah, we have a pretty huge collection. I think considering that it's an open library that you can sort of waltz into and play games. It's one of the biggest around. And we have a lot of old games precisely because we want students to play those games and do their own research. Our students are involved in making their own games. We think that they should have a big catalog available to them, both for their classwork, but also just for inspiration. And so we have it set up so people can just check out and play games right there in the library. And we have like a lot of old consoles, so you can play on original hardware, but we're turning increasingly to emulation in order to really bulk up the catalog, right? And we have some super carts and things like that. And that I think is also probably going to, obviously affects the secondhand market. I've heard reports of a lot of people buying used consoles, which doesn't entirely surprise me because, there, of course, every generation that's currently alive is having to stay at home. And so people who remember the consoles that they used to play when they were younger are probably trying to dig those out or maybe get a copy of those things. And it's maybe only a matter of time until some of them figure out, oh, wow, I could emulate all of this stuff. And it's like being a kid in a candy store, right? And so we'll see what happens with that.
As someone who's really interested in the culture of video games, I think one defining aspect between America and Japan is in Japan, arcades still thrive, and there's still a lot of a face-to-face interaction with other video gamers, where in America, a lot of it's done online. And that's the thing about NYU Game Center that I really like when I visited, because you have a lot of people you can just rent out or borrow like a Super Nintendo and a Super Nintendo game. Maybe just sit there in the middle of an open area and someone's playing and someone can come by and like, hey, what are you doing? What are you playing? And then just have a conversation, develop friendship, share knowledge, and stuff like that. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk. I don't want to dwell too much on education, but how much of it is a challenge has it been now you need to be a game design instructor? Because one of the most cornerstones is like just having player feedback, watching someone play, seeing them struggle, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's been pretty difficult. That was one of the first challenges that hit us. We had about maybe 3 or 4 days notice that we were going to switch from teaching in person to teaching online. So it really, I think, one of the biggest things that we had to figure out how to play test games entirely online. Zoom has actually ended up being pretty useful for that, along with tools like Parsec, which let you play almost any game as if it's in the cloud. With you host a game session, but if somebody else has a controller plugged in on their machine on the other side of the internet, they can actually play as if they have a controller plugged into your own machine. So this, I think, is also going to affect local multiplayer games like you're talking about, Matt. It's so nice to be able to roll up and sit with someone else and play. And we're big fans at NYU of what some people call the new arcade movement, the idea that like, oh, you could bring back those types of games, like revitalize the arcade. I think it's been really difficult for places like Wonderville, an arcade and bar that just recently opened in Brooklyn. They've had a really hard time sort of opening up and being in the first year of their business with a pandemic also hitting, right? So there may be some kind of way forward where there's a hybrid of local and virtual, right? Like we're used to thinking of online games as things that you play and you don't see or socially interact much with the people on the other side of the screen. Maybe you have a guild in the best case circumstances, but a lot of the rest of the time you want to keep your mic off so that you don't have to listen to like a 12-year-old screaming obscenities at you. But with the video conferencing getting so powerful now and services like Discord adding video, I think it's maybe only a matter of time until multiplayer game design also starts to become more social in a way that actually incorporates people's presence. Maybe through video like we're doing right now, but there might be other things on the horizon that will give people a little bit more of that in-person shared experience. So we'll see.
Now, it's funny you mention that because Ollie, as a reporter for Forbes, you probably know this already, and perhaps I'm assuming that quite a few people in the audience know this already, that Sega recently celebrated its 60th anniversary, and one of the big announcements was some sort of a cloud platforming where people can play arcade games when the arcades are closed. Do you have any information about that?
This was to do with fog gaming.
Gaming, yes.
And it's kind of a bit more than that because so cloud gaming is basically you're playing a game on a separate server, like miles away. Whereas fog gaming, it's to help sort of bridge that gap, what they're actually doing, and it's kind of a smart thing to help the arcades in this sort of economic downturn, or with all the people not being able to go to arcades so much, is by actually using the arcade machines when they're not in use. So like when the arcades close, so they can use the processing power from those arcade machines to kind of bridge the networking gap and the power gap with the servers, so they can actually increase response times and lag, reduce lag. So it's a fascinating way of using a very widely distributed resource across Japan in a kind of a very smart technical way.
Do gamers in Japan, are they aware of how video games are perceived in America?
No, not at all. I mean, and game creators are all, it's actually quite nice because they're completely sort of shocked and amazed that anyone has ever played any of their games ever. And it's almost consistent with every single person you talk to. Some of them have an idea that, Western, games made outside of Japan are, very sophisticated in some ways and can be very much like playing an interactive movie. But generally I would say it's quite insular.
Naomi, we talked about how it's very vital, and Dan, I'm sure you can chime in this as well, that there's a lot of feedback between players and game creators. But Ollie, is there that much in Japan? Do the game creators have much of the dialogue?
Oh yes. Now with social media, especially with Twitter, it's just constant dialogue between gamers and the developers, often directly. So and also generally there's not really the sense that developers are kind of on some kind of pedestal anyway, and they're kind of just the same as the people that are playing the games because they come from the same source. So they're generally, very much treat them as though you're the same person as me. So I respect what you're saying. So
yeah, and I'm sorry, Matt.
No.
Because I agree with what Ali just said, and I wanted to connect it back with what Naomi said earlier regarding playtesting. And one of the things that from my perspective, the video game industry is unlike any other. You don't necessarily see the level of responsiveness that video game developers and publishers have in the car industry or with mobile technology or with TV sets. I could hate my TV set, but that doesn't mean that Sony's going to change it based upon what my plan about on Twitter. They could, it'd be awesome, but I don't think that they're going to. And so the two-way dialogue that we have with our fans and our community is critical, and it is paramount to making sure that we maintain that high level of engagement. And so that is why we have entire teams at Gearbox, and I know that's true for other publishers and developers as well, that specifically engage with the community both here in Texas and across the world, and especially Japan, for games that we are targeting for the Japanese community. But Naomi brought something up that is equally true, and it dovetails this, which is the player feedback that we get when we go through playtest, and making sure that when we bring people into the studio and we set them up and they're playing through a game and we see, okay, what was too easy, what was too challenging, that's the real-time feedback that we desperately need to ensure that we end up shipping a great game. So I think that both of those points are relevant and true.
Actually, another question for you, Dan.
I just answered that one. Don't I get off the hook for a second?
I wanted to. I think Naomi can kind of chime in on this. How has it been with Gearbox in terms of development working from home?
Yeah.
Has it been easier or has it been difficult? Because I know I come from an indie background, indie game dev background, and Naomi can attest to this, that there's a lot of indie game developers who primarily work from home. They also work in co-working spaces and coffee shops, like Wonderville. They have a co-working thing, but they've obviously had to cease that. But how has it been for a large studio such as Gearbox?
Yeah, worse. And I think that it is. I will give you the sunshiny version, and then I'll give you the unvarnished version. The sunshiny version is that we have been working smoothly and seamlessly in sending dev kits home, making sure that the dev kits are secure. We have begun relying a lot on streaming technology like Zoom. Microsoft Teams has been fantastic. And so we're making sure that we're also utilizing technology like Confluence and Jira, and making sure that we're staying on task and meeting our milestones. So that's all been great. I will be frank with you and tell you that one of the things that we have missed and have really worked hard to overcome is that daily interaction and that connection, that those pickup games that happen in the lobby or in our playroom, where people are just exchanging ideas and whiteboarding concepts. You don't necessarily have that connectivity on a moment's notice. And so that is why we have taken to Discord, for example, and having open chats throughout the day. So while you may have multiple people working in a multitude of locations, you still can just speak up and speak out and be able to have that person right there. So that's been a little bit of a challenge, but it's something that we're using technology to overcome.
Now, Ollie, do you know if game development has been affected at all by COVID?
Yeah, it has. I mean, sadly, unlike in the States where, and especially sort of in Europe, where things like streaming technology and people being able to kind of communicate remotely is quite commonplace, Japan, weirdly, is actually somewhat behind on that. And it's actually a lot more sort of socially interactive in terms of the development process. So it's difficult. I mean, from my experience and from what I've dealt with, I think it's definitely had an impact on game production, but how much it's probably going to be kind of made more clear in the next few months. But it's not quite as smooth as what Dan is describing.
Yeah, and I think that I think that while we're all struggling and trying to find a new normal and a new balance, because for Gearbox, our priority is making sure that our team members are safe and that we're not putting them in a bad situation. So I don't think that we necessarily want to be the first zebra across the river, to use a phrase. And we want to make sure that we continue to protect our most important corporate studio asset, which is our employees. That being said, I think that it's something that we'll be happy when this is over and we can get back into the studio and continue to make games.
Well, I think certain people would be upset if I didn't ask this question, but as you know, tomorrow Sony's having a big presentation for the PlayStation 5. The big question is, two questions. Is it going to happen this year? I guess it looks like it. So that means the second question is, do we really need it right now? Not really.
Do we need it right now? No, that's an interesting one. I think that there are tons of fans of console games, fans of Sony products who would absolutely love to get a delivery at home of a new PlayStation. I think it is becoming more and more difficult, in my opinion, both as an independent developer and as an industry observer, and someone who has to counsel students on their future careers, to justify the escalation of hardware, right? So we've seen beautiful things that can be done with ray tracing, some of the recent demos that have been coming out from Unreal, and it looks nicer and nicer, but I think it's also, even among the general game playing population, people know, like, okay, that only goes so far. The real meat of any game is in the experience, the interactivity, the mechanics, the systems, all the texture that goes into creating those worlds. And that's not necessarily about being able to push even more polygons, right? I actually think maybe the biggest impact, the most exciting thing for me about the next generation of hardware and next generation of Unreal is that it will improve the pipelines inside of companies. Of course, Dan can comment on that as well, that it's just easier to produce lots of different, I guess I shouldn't throw around technical terms like LODs, but different versions of 3D models. It's not going to be as time consuming, and that will hopefully free up resources both to make employees' lives better, but also to to focus on other forms of creativity that aren't all about hardware.
Yeah, and Naomi, if you have students, please send me their portfolios.
Excellent, excellent, good. All right, good.
We are all, that is we are continuing to grow in Frisco, and we absolutely have a broad trajectory ahead of us. So, you know, I love the fact that Naomi, the work that you're doing is fantastic, because we need more computer and video game education programs out there.
Now, you know, the thing is, the reason why we're having this Sony event tomorrow, there's actually going to be quite a few throughout this whole month. We've already had a few. Is E3's been canceled. Like, Dan, how do you feel about that? I mean, was it really necessary?
Personally, professionally, yeah. You know, like I said, I ran the show for 15 years, and I will always love the show. But I think that one of the big challenges is how do you bring people together in an environment during a pandemic, and obviously we're all upset the fact that we don't have E3. It's a great marketing tool. It's a great way to get worldwide exposure. It's a great way to get content in fans' hands. But I think that the ESA made the right decision. I think that if they would have gone ahead with E3 this year, that would have been an irresponsible decision. I think that it enables show organizers now to go back to first principles and identify where they need to continue to evolve the event. What you're seeing this summer, whether it's IGN Summer of Gaming or Jeff Keighley's event or any of these other events that we're seeing, and including you know, Gamescom in Germany is also going digital. There's going to be a digital component of Tokyo Game Show. It's all about publishers and developers figuring out a way to connect directly with fans in a new way. And that's part of what I'm really excited about this summer, because there's so many people trying so many different things. And we've completely torn up the playbook as an industry about how do we market, how do we sell, how do we engage, and we're going down a new path.
I mean, I think it could be argued that, I try to always find the silver lining in a lot of things, and I think COVID has kind of accelerated in some people's minds the inevitability that a lot of these things are going to be virtual. There's more direct interaction between the developer and the audience.
I think that's fair. I think that there's always going to be a place for in-person events, both from a business perspective and from a fan perspective. There is no greater joy on a community space than when they're with 30,000 of their compatriots and people who love that same type of content and games that they love. I think that, and you can speak to this matter, or maybe Ali can, but I think that journalists also enjoy having that ease of going from meeting to meeting to meeting and meeting multiple publishers and developers at one time, and having that tentpole moment. But I also think that retailers are certainly looking for opportunities to get a sense as to how games are being received in real time. You know, certainly we're not in the days anymore where 50% of industry revenue comes in the fourth quarter, but there are buyers from major retailers who are looking at events and saying, look, I want to go, I want to see your game, and I want to see how it's being received.
Now, Ollie, has Tokyo Game Show for this year been officially canceled, or
Yes.
are you still hearing about that? Okay. I mean,
well, as in the public shows, but as in like, yeah, I think they might do something digitally.
can you discuss a bit more about? Can you explain to us all about Tokyo Game Show, how different it is to E3?
Yeah. So, I mean, E3 is very much an industry event, whereas Tokyo Game Show is a public event. So you have 2 days of, you know, press and business, followed by the 2 public days. And what's very interesting about the Tokyo Game Show in that regard is that you actually get to see what, you know, the players want to, you know, go to and play with. So there's always this very different kind of dynamic on the, you know, the business days where the press just go for the games they're interested in, and then the gamers kind of go for what they want to play.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because you get to see, you know, I mean, it's always like everyone goes crazy for Monster Hunter. So that's just like every year it's like a beeline for that. So, but that's generally very interesting. Yeah.
How do you feel about Tokyo Game Show shutting down? You both as a journalist, but also as someone who you're also in the industry as a developer, but it's also just as a game fan.
I mean, it's sad, but I think, as Dan said, it's the responsible thing to do. And it's not just Tokyo Game Show. I mean, other events like Wonder Festival, which covers toys and model kits, and Anime Japan, which covers anime, those have all been kind of stopped this year. And I love going to those events. And yeah, it's sad that they are not around this year, but I think it will kind of return to normal next year, definitely. But yeah, I think they're trying to make up for it with some kind of digital event.
Well, I mean, you kind of mentioned this earlier that things are a bit different in Japan. They're a bit more old-fashioned in terms of the prevalence of brick and mortar shops. Has digital game sales increased in Japan at all because of the pandemic? Or?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, most of the modern consoles are, obviously online, and they have online shops. So people are, buying more games digitally because it's just more convenient and there's just easier access. So that in itself has had a massive impact, I think, definitely.
And I mean, Dan, obviously you guys you've been selling games online for a while, digitally. But do you foresee, are you guys still selling as many physical copies as you used to before? Is that slowing down? Do you think you'll ever go no physical?
No, I mean, I think that there's always going to be, and I think that there's the beauty of the video game industry is that we provide content with how people want it. So I think that there's always going to be a physical component. I think, of course, if you look at the earnings calls of public companies, everybody's saying that this has been, to your point, Matt, a silver lining in this horrible situation that the world is in. But what I take part in, and that's obviously not going to be able to carry through for forever. I think that it's going to stabilize a little bit. Is it going to go back to pre-virus times? I don't think so. I think that as people are playing games, they're going to continue to play games, maybe not as quite high of a rate, but I don't think that there's going to be a massive drop-off. And the reason for that is that you're seeing a greater level of engagement. I don't know if you all saw, but Twitch, and for those who are in the audience are not familiar, is an incredibly popular video game streaming platform. Came out with numbers, and in April they had, I want to say, 1.5 billion gaming hours in 1 month. That's a lot of video games being played, and that's a lot of connections being made. And that was a 50% increase over March. And so I think that is something that people are going to continue to come back for, and they're going to continue playing that. So that's where I see things heading. But you know what? We'll see. That's my thought.
Not to fixate on the whole physical versus digital aspect, but no, I mean, obviously you're working with a lot of students, and the primary means of distributing their games is via itch, and hopefully getting to storefronts such as Steam, GOG, and such like that. Do you talk with students who they dream to have a physical, tangible version of their game, which does happen via limited run and other services or intermediaries?
Sure, yeah. I mean, student games, a lot like, say, a student film or something like that, right? They are not distributed via the biggest channels, right? You can't waltz into a store that sells DVDs of movies and buy student films there either. But digital distribution has really changed how much exposure students can get. So do they kind of fetishize the packaged product? I guess I do have some students who have done that boutique thing of making a limited run, kind of like releasing an album on vinyl, right? Like musicians these days, when they're getting started, they probably once you get up to a certain level, you've released some CDs, but it's mostly online, right? And then for collectors, for people if you have real diehard fans, and maybe you do release some vinyl. But yeah, even I've been working in the industry for over 20 years. I probably only have a handful of games because most of my work has been in smaller titles, casual games, which are mostly been downloadable. I have maybe like 6 or 7 games that I actually have packaged products of. So yeah, I think that it may be something that my students probably associate with, well, if you work at a really big, huge company, or a big company like Gearbox, say, right, then you would have a packaged product, but otherwise, like, you generally won't have one of your game.
I mean, and also in addition to, for me, when I think about video games Japan, it's not so much Tokyo Game Show, it's Wonder Festival, because you have a lot of like independent designers who produce, like Ollie, like you go to one, how many copies of their games have they made in a physical version? Sometimes it could be as little as 5 or 10, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's also Comiket as well, which is another really good example with all the Dojin games as well. One Festival is great for the, people making all their handcrafted model kits, which they then sell. But the Comiket, the Dojin scene is absolutely huge. And you're right. I mean, there's a definite sort of difference in terms of how they focus more on the physical, tactile element of media rather than the digital side. And the digital side is more about convenience rather than, people will always still want to have something physical. So, I mean, when they go to Comiket, I mean, even though those are indie games effectively, they are, selling them as physical, material. I mean, you don't normally get given a download code, right? You actually get something that you can physically hold.
So, I think, again, not to state the obvious, but a lot of games from Japan takes a lot of themes from American culture and kind of remixes it, kind of like, the whole cool Japan ethos. And it's funny, if you look at games from the 80s and 90s, they take a lot of popular tropes and themes from American entertainment. Do you see, is there more of an emphasis on presenting Japanese culture in Japanese games, or is it still like the kind of like remixed version of American? Because it's kind of global, it kind of sells across the globe. Right? Everyone loves American entertainment. So
yeah, right. I think it's just generally a big mix. I mean, you're right. I mean, back in like the 80s, like Metal Gear and Contra, you would have all these references to 80s, American 80s action movies. So that is still very much prevalent. But I mean, Japanese culture was always very much involved in sort of the gaming process. Well, I think what's interesting sort of generally about sort of the Japanese games industry is how they take influences from everywhere, not only sort of within Japan, but globally as well, and then repackage them in their own unique way. So I think it's not just about sort of taking in American culture, it's just taking in everything, whatever they find interesting at any one point, really.
How do Japanese gamers feel about when they see a game from America that deals heavily with Japanese themes? Like, are they happy? Are they impressed? Are they critical? Maybe a combination of all three?
Yeah, I think that's basically, it's a combination of all three. I mean, there is some crossover with American games into Japan, but I think from what I've seen, it's generally much more the other way. But you're right in saying that there is a big influence of American culture, absolutely. But I think it's more. It really depends on how the game treats sort of Japanese culture. It really is like a case-by-case situation, really.
And unfortunately, we're running short on time. But Naomi, real quick, how do you feel? Have you been in a situation where a student wanted to create a game, just for the sake of this conversation, who wanted to do a game that's steeped in Japanese culture, Japanese mythology? How do you, as an educator, approach that type of request or viewpoint, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of students. A lot of my students are huge fans of games before they decide to pursue a career in games, right? And in game culture, there are, of course, a lot of people who are influenced by Japanese culture and Japanese games. So yeah, those themes do crop up. I think, yeah, I've been surprised. My students are often pretty savvy about trying to modulate those things more than I think I was afraid they might be when I first encountered these issues. And I think that among the among this set, and we're talking about, students in their 20s for the most part, right? They know that they don't want to be perceived as somebody who is just a Japanese culture fan and that's their whole identity, right? If they're trying to produce a creative work, they know that, okay, they need to like put something of themselves in it. They don't want to just be sort of slavishly copying anime tropes, right? That's something that like maybe they got over in high school. So I think actually we should give more credit to the young people these days, that they already know that there's this route they could go down of being a little bit too imitative. And instead they're synthesizing stuff and making their own kind of new global culture. Like just as we see so many Japanese creators taking influences from all over and mixing it into something really cool in a Japanese game, the influx of Japanese games into American, especially like independent game culture, I think has allowed that same kind of spirit to be fostered all over the world, and maybe as an inspiration, right? So you remix things, you make it your own thing. It's not just about like, I want to make something Japanese.
Now, Dan, I know that your games are sold globally. Is there any changes that are made to Gearbox games for the Japanese market? Or I suppose I could ask that for every, other than localization in terms of languages.
Okay, so I was going to go with Loke, but yes, that's where we're going to go with that one. I think that we work with our partners to make sure that games are appropriately rated, that consumers are aware of what's in the game, and so that's why I think it's so important to work around like the Japanese game rating body. And making sure that if we're bringing games into the Japanese market, and we may have smoking or violence or any type of activity, gambling that may be of concern to a Japanese audience, that the Japanese consumers are aware of that. I can tell you that right now we're working on, you all may have seen that we announced Godfall last fall, which will be coming out this holiday season, and we anticipate that it's going to be big in Japan, and so that is what we are looking at and doing testing for, to say, all right, if we believe that based upon the feedback that we're getting from surveys and play tests, that this is going to be popular among the Japanese audience, we certainly are going to tack towards that in terms of marketing. But I think at the end of the day, the commonality between American players and Japanese players is that they're both looking for a rich, immersive environment. They're both looking for great stories, good sound, compelling graphics, and that is what we keep our focus on.
Well, we're pretty much coming to the home stretch, so it's time to address the questions from the audience, which has been sent to me. So I'm just going to say this, and I'd like to just go down the line and see, what you guys have to say. First question: hasn't gaming and gamers really expanded since old stereotypes? There have been studies showing more and more women are playing games in more age groups. Does anyone want to address that?
Yes.
Yeah,
definitely. It's just it's no longer the same world as it was, I think, when maybe many of us were getting started in games. There are just many more different types of games. I think this was mentioned during some of the early questions, right? There's a greater diversity of types of games, subject matter in games, in Japanese games too, everything from Animal Crossing to Dark Souls. So that just opens the audience up much wider as well. And so in some corners, I think the stereotypes still persist about who a gamer is. And those stereotypes can be perpetuated by people outside of games, but also inside games, right? To sort of keep it a closed club. But I think that's starting to die out. It's something that's still found in like some corners, in some corners of the culture. Yeah.
Naomi, I think you're 100% right on that. And I've devoted my entire professional career to expanding the frontier for video games and bringing video games to new audiences. And from when I started, there's been a real sea change in the demographics of who is playing. Folks may be surprised to know that currently more adult women play video games than teenage boys. And that's astounding. And I mean, it's wonderful and it's fantastic. But have we done enough as an industry to go out there and get new audiences? I think that we can always do more. I think that there's something like 2.6 billion players around the world, and that's still a long way to go to make sure that there's a game in everyone's hand.
Yeah, from a Japanese perspective, I mean, it's always been very diverse because it's just part of the culture, and that there's a very large mix of, everyone playing, all sorts of different types of games, and that's not only true from a sort of a gaming perspective, as in from people who buy and play games, but also from a development perspective, because there is an enormous mix of people in sort of game development, with many high-profile games such as Animal Crossing, for example, having a lady as the game director. So it's a very mixed, sort of already quite diverse market here, which I find quite interesting. It's very different from, let's say, because I'm from Britain originally. It's very different from how things are necessarily there. So I think that it'd be nice to kind of see more of that covered, really.
I mean, I just want to chime in real quick. I think nothing spoke to me personally about how much video games is part of Japanese culture, and in terms of challenging the stereotypes of what a gamer and games are, is when I was in Japan in late December, and at the time, Japan and Tokyo was advertising the Olympics, and you would just find, I think it was the Japanese government had aligned with Nintendo to basically have Nintendo characters in quick spots on the train, just giving factoids, etc., like that. So, and I think we're seeing more examples of that in America, where just instead of just like, oh, are you a gamer? I mean, like we're all, everyone's essentially a gamer, right? We all play video games, etc., like that. I think the distinction is becoming a little antiquated. But anyways, on to the next question. The second question from the audience is: esports has been an attractive, growing industry in the last few years. Which direction do you think the industry will go? Naomi, I want to start with you first, because I think there's probably have a lot of students who are into esports and maybe want to create esport games.
For sure. I mean, I think that it's just continuing to grow. It's really been amazing in that sector's ability to drive massive events. Of course, that's, I think, changing right now with the pandemic, but I imagine we'll pick up again at some point. I think it's really consolidating. You're seeing like a lot of large companies trying to get in on the esports area. I don't think the growth of the industry is going to be rapid enough to just support every company having its own esports game, right? At some point, there's going to be a little bit of a shakeout there. And what the unknown for me is whether we're going to see a succession of games replacing each other, right? Which is very different than traditional sports, where we've been playing basketball for a very, very long time now, right? All the sports are the same way. But with the commercial nature of games as products, there's a possibility that everyone will want to play the next latest, greatest esport. That I think is going to be a little bit of a challenge for the industry, because right now esports products are making a bunch of money off of the sports, the competitive side of things, but then also off of selling that same product for people to play at home and sort of engage a little bit in the fantasy of, oh, I could kind of play in the minor leagues. And that's going to be difficult to do in an ongoing way if you don't have an evergreen model like Riot had for many years with League of Legends. But now they're rolling out more products as well, and sort of getting into this game of putting out the next esport game. As for my students, I think it's interesting. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there were a lot of students who wanted to get into the esports and sort of try and create the next one. But it's become clear that it's just a massive undertaking to sort of try and roll out an esport, right? To sort of devise what the next one isn't something that you can do in a small team. And really, you kind of have to wait for lightning to strike if you want to create something new. And other new genres are going to spring out of esports as well. Like I kind of consider the battle royale game to be, you know, a little bit of an evolution of the resurgence in multiplayer competitive games, right? So that and battle royale games are not exactly esports. There's some other whole new kettle of fish, and you know, Fortnite is going off and becoming less game-like but more popular, right? So I think there's just going to be a continued proliferation.
Matt?
Yes. I was just wondering if you two had also anything to like, is esports, from what I've seen, you know, esports has a different flavor from each region of the world. I mean, when you say esports, it could mean a lot of different things. I mean, is esports popular in Japan?
I mean, in the e sense, in the electronic sense and the online sense, not so much. But the interesting thing about when people think of esports, they think of sort of communal and multiplayer aspects. What that basically means is arcades. And arcades have been in Japan forever. So that hasn't really changed. And arcades are very much a big part of the multiplayer sort of gaming landscape. So, you know, you have these very big sort of releases, like all the major Street Fighter games are still hugely popular. You know, Tekken is still huge. I mean, then you have new things like Gundam Extreme Versus, which is just enormously popular and networked across the country. So those are technically electronic in the sense that they're kind of communicating between arcades. But generally, esports in Japan is very much sort of arcade centric.
Gotcha. Now, Dan, how much has esports changed Gearbox's goals in the past, currently, forward? Like, is it something that's factored in at all?
You know, and I think that Naomi really hit on it. I think that developing esports is incredibly hard, and not every game obviously is suited to that. And I think that we have seen other ham-handed, bless their hearts, attempts to try to back engineer a video game into an esports model. And I think that Naomi is 100% right when she said that not every game is appropriate or right for an esport. Naomi, I think, is fair in saying that. And you know, it's important that developers know who they are and what they're trying to do. And it's okay if your game is not going to be an esport game. I believe that there's certainly going to be a continued increase for esports for two factors. And it's reading the tea leaves, reading the signs. One is that colleges and universities are, as many of your viewers may have seen, now giving out scholarships for students to come be esports athletes at their colleges or universities. And the second is you're starting to see a lot of U.S. companies like Comcast put together sports teams. These are very smart people at both of those institutions and institutions like that. And I think that they're reading the tea leaves and seeing that there's future growth, or else they wouldn't be making those investments.
Real quick, one last question for everyone. Views on games in terms of being an educational tool, especially since, you know, online education is, due to COVID, is becoming more and more of a talking point.
I will jump in, mostly because we just have launched what's called Borderlands Science, which is a citizen science initiative. It's a mini game within Borderlands where people can help map the human gut biome and learn about how the protein in your gut works. And so I think that there's a great opportunity for video games to be educational tools. I think that the question that you always have to ask yourself is, does it have to be dry? And the answer is no. And that comes back to the core development process and making sure that you're baking in fun to the game, or else you're going to be trying to feed kids Brussels sprouts. But Naomi and Ali could probably speak to that better than I could.
Yeah, I think it's been an ongoing challenge for exactly the reason that Dan mentions. It can be tricky to both convey a message, even an educational message, and also really maintain the things that make a game really fun. But what I'm encouraged by is I just see more and more experiments happening to explore the educational side of games. And they're happening in very large games like Dan just mentioned, and in and Ubisoft continues to do interesting things educationally in their Assassin's Creed games with sort of teaching about architecture and history and special educational modes in those games. And we're seeing continued more experiments in smaller scale games and in mobile games and so forth too. So I'm convinced that if we just sort of continue exploring the potential of games in this direction to be more than just escapist fun, but also to comment on the world around us or teach us something, we'll eventually get better and better at it to the point where it won't seem strange at all that a game that's entertaining is also, really thought-provoking or teaching us something at the same time, that we might just think, yeah, that's a completely normal thing that a good game does. Just like we might think that about, watching a really great film. Oh, I'm learning a little bit about the history of New York City in this film that's set in the 20s in New York, right? That doesn't seem strange. We're going to get to that point with games eventually.
Actually, this conversation made me realize I've never thought about the place of games in education in Japan. Ollie, is that even a thing?
It is. It's a massive thing. I mean, back
Really?
in March, there was a very sort of big story about, because obviously school graduations couldn't happen. And a school basically in sort of Japan decided to do their graduation in Minecraft. So Minecraft, for example, has a very big place already, sort of in a cultural sense. It's very, very popular in Japan. It's kind of obvious. It's basically like an interactive toy, effectively. So obviously, it's going to be popular, and that has been used across the board for all sorts of, sort of communal elements. So I mean, the points that Naomi mentioned about Fortnite becoming more than just a game and more like a cultural hub. I mean, that's kind of what Minecraft is at the moment in Japan in some ways. So it is already happening here. It's probably manifesting a bit differently in terms of they're not actually trying to teach a specific idea or piece of history through the game. They're just using it more as a cultural conduit.
Well, it is now past 7 o'clock. I think our time is up. Paul, do you have any final words for us?
Yes. Well, again, thank you so much to Matthew for moderating today's program. Thank you to all of our panelists for their insights on the gaming industry. We greatly appreciate your time and willingness to share. We would also like to express our gratitude to everyone who attended the program and for your eagerness to explore the U.S.-Japan relationship. We apologize that we could not get to all your questions, but if you have anything specific you would like to know, please send an email to info@jasdfw.org. Again, it's info@jasdfw.org, and we will send that to our panelists. We kindly ask that you complete the post-event survey, which will be sent to all attendees on our follow-up email that will be sent out tomorrow. If you are unable to view this or access the survey, we will share it again through other means if necessary. If you enjoy programming like this, we ask that you consider making a donation to the Japan America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth, and we will share information again in the chat function. Again, that will be on tomorrow's email. I invite everyone to join us for our next program. I think the screen will be coming up. Great, it's there. Titled the Texas Radio Taiso Challenge. And this, as you can see on the screen, will celebrate popular Japanese exercises that we will learn from a professional radio Taiso presenter. The program will be this Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Central Time, Dallas. And please visit our website to learn more. Please also save the date in 2 weeks for a special program. It should be coming up on the screen now again. Great, okay. This will be our wa shoku program. So that is another term for Japanese food. And this event will be at 12 p.m. on Thursday, June 25th. Again, that is Dallas time. And registration will open on our website by the end of the week. So please go back either tomorrow or on Friday. We're also working on additional summer programming covering health and wellness, a virtual edition of our annual sake tasting program, and a discussion on the long-term COVID-19 strategy for Japan. Please check our website, www.jasdfw.org, for regular updates as we schedule more events throughout the summer and into the fall. This concludes tonight's program. Thank you for attending and have a wonderful rest of your evening or morning for those in Japan. Thank you so much.